Dear God, thank you for music that calms us, focuses us, helps us get our feet on the ground again. May we continue to worship in that meditative moment and mood. Amen. So in today's text, as you heard, Jesus has turned 30. A former carpenter, he has begun a second career as a teacher, rabbi, teacher, same word. Did you ever make a vocational change? Most people do. If so, when did it happen? As I said, Jesus was 30. Think back for a moment to when you were 30, unless you're 19. Well, here are a couple of first-person stories to set the background for us. A woman from Los Angeles writes, she says, I had wanted to greet the age 30 at the door of my very own house, wearing a sleeveless linen dress and holding a glass of Pinot Noir. Please come in, I'd say, and smile warmly. I've been expecting you. 30 and I would glide across my pristine hardwood floors, sit down on the couch and laugh together over the worst parts of my life. As we rehashed each devastating incident, all the pain would miraculously be gone, replaced by a calm acceptance and quiet thankfulness. I'm glad that's all behind me, I would say, pouring myself another glass of wine. Well, I turned 30 in a few months. The reality is, I rent an apartment, I look awful in dresses, and until I lose 30 pounds, sleeves are an absolute necessity. My hardwood floors are scarred and spotted with suspicious dark patches. Sometimes I take photos of the patches to make sure they aren't getting bigger. I have no master plan. I worry, I get depressed. I'm anxious much of the time. I wish I could earn a living and still manage to exercise, eat vegetables, be creative, practice yoga, meditate, volunteer, socialize, relax. At the very least, I'd like to be able to get up when my alarm goes off. Why do I drink so much when it gives me such bad headaches? When am I finally going to switch careers, she says. Why, after I've spent so many years in therapy, can one call from my mother send me into a week-long depression? If you can relate to the last part of that, remember that in the Gospel of John, Jesus' ministry begins with a misunderstanding with his mother over a wine shortage at somebody else's wedding. Okay. Again, I'm setting the ground here. Here's the second story. This is from Dennis Donahue of Rowley, Massachusetts, age 30. This is going to be good because we had that music to get it to start. Dennis says, I'd had it with teaching. I worked in special ed, very difficult, and was never sure how much I accomplished. I wanted a physical job where I could see the fruits of my labor and wouldn't bring the work home with me. So I took a job delivering packages. I wore a brown uniform and carried a clipboard. At first, I enjoyed the work, especially returning at the end of the day with an empty truck. But then my supervisor began to time me, insisting I drive faster and deliver more packages. I also realized that most of the packages contained junk that people would be better off without. I began to miss teaching, in particular the look on a kid's face when he or she finally figured out how to divide fractions or walk away from a fight. One day I delivered several boxes of textbooks to a junior high school. I was standing at the principal's desk with my clipboard, waiting for him to get off the phone. Where in God's name, he said into the receiver, am I going to find a certified special ed teacher 2 months into a school year? I gave him his answer. So again, Jesus has changed vocations when we meet him in this morning's text from Luke. He's been out teaching. It's difficult, but things have gone well for him. Everyone is elated with his teaching. There's just something charismatic about him. And then he comes back to Nazareth, to the synagogue there, and he stands up to read. And there was given him the book of the prophet Isaiah, and he opened it and found the place where it's written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So he's saying, look, this is my vocation. I found it. I'm 30 years old. Now, 30 is old in the ancient world. In today's world, a young person can go to med school, do an internship, have a residency, and begin a long practice at the age of 30. Well, it's not the case in Jesus' time. Mark's gospel says Jesus was a carpenter, as I said, in the first go-round, and I mentioned this in a recent sermon. The Greek word there is not the same as someone who makes dining room sets or coffee tables. This is somebody who works in construction. Maybe he helped out on building projects in the Roman town of Sepphoris, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump from Nazareth. That's where the money in his day was going. So construction may have been his career, but preaching, he's saying, is his calling. Now, it's interesting to note that the root words of car and career both come from the same Latin word carrera, which means racetrack, which might be revealing. The word vocation, on the other hand, comes from the Latin word vocare, which means a call. Vocation is a calling. Where a career demands intelligence to learn a skill, to learn how to get from here to there. A calling, by contrast, demands a certain amount of inner quiet. It's about listening to a voice within. This often manifests itself in questions that we ask ourselves quite naturally. Is what I'm doing really worth all the trouble? Why do I bother? What difference with what I'm doing will happen in the long run? Calls are seldom loud, resounding summons from the heavens, a divine subpoena. They are instead quiet reminders. Often they are recognizable visitations, in fact. We sense them in serendipity, a line from a movie that comes back and haunts us for weeks, or a paragraph from a book that says, hello. You know those things. T.S. Eliot has written that our lives are measured out in coffee spoons. So these serendipitous visitations come to us, coffee spoon size mostly. We sense we need to reconnect with someone, a former teacher, dead or living, an old friend, a wise aunt. We decide to pick up an old book we haven't touched in years, but we don't know why it's so important. But we have to look into it. We look at a class catalog maybe a little longer than we'd imagine we'd look at it. These are all minor fire drills that are about larger callings. Wallace Stevens once wrote, "I don't ask for the full ringing of the bell. I don't ask for a clap of thunder that would rend the veil in the temple. A scrawny cry will do from far off there among the willows and the cattails, from far off there among the galaxies." So calls are essentially questions. They are not questions that you need to answer outright. They ask us merely to entertain them, sup with them, acknowledge that something is tugging on us. In fact, you don't want an answer you will just put in a box and store away on a shelf of memory. You want a question that will become a chariot to carry you across the breadth of your life, a question that will offer you a lifetime of pondering, that will lead you toward what you need to know for the preservation of your sense of yourself. a man named Greg Lvov wrote a book called Callings. He says that there are two essential questions for us to ask ourselves in this regard. One, what's right for me? And two, where am I willing to be led? I happen to believe that discernment demands that we ask these two questions continually and devotedly. That way, providence will manifest itself enough times so that the answers will eventually find us. That's really important. In sculpting stone, sculptors continually test the stone by tapping on it, right? If the tone becomes dull, you sense a fault in that area in which you're working, which demands imagination lest you crack it. A clear ring, though, one that hangs in the air, means it's true, has integrity, and will hold up to repeated blows. This is what we're looking for when we are tapping on our lives. It takes devotion, lots of tapping, lots of questions. So, if you're bored with your work today, does it mean you need to leave it or change it? If you don't get the job you were looking for, does it mean you weren't meant to pursue that career? Or, as with the teacher who drove for UPS for a while, is it a test of your resolve? Or maybe, just a kind of sabbatical. 2 decades ago, I was given a generous summer sabbatical. I received a grant from the Louisville Institute to study the lives of 2 poets who were not in academic life. Most poets are. There's not enough money in poetry to even buy postage stamps. Well, those 2 poets were professionals in medicine and ministry. One was William Carlos Williams, a physician, and I interviewed a friend of his and learned that Williams got just the fodder he needed to write his poems by making house calls on his patients. It was how he got the energy to stay in the medical profession well into his 70s, because every night at 10 p.m. he would wind down by writing poetry about his day. His work as a doctor gave him the insight necessary to write his poems, and the poetry gave him the energy and the meaning he needed to go back out the next day and take care of his patients. Interesting balance, right? Then I took my family to Wales in the United Kingdom to look closely at the life of a dead poet there named R.S. Thomas, who'd been an Anglican priest. Here was a man who'd served at church in the Welsh-English border for 12 years and then moved into the heart of Welsh-speaking Wales in his mid-30s because he wanted to learn that old native language his Welsh parents, had been too ashamed to teach him. At first he thought he'd moved to paradise, but he ended up being terribly unhappy because the church he went to was run by retired British military who insisted on being called major and colonel, that kind of thing. He coped for years by writing poetry about the rural people who'd been in his former parish. He even became quite famous writing those poems. Then in his 12th year there, in the heart of Welsh Wales, he reached a breaking point. He didn't go to work for UPS. No, instead, he went into the city next door to him and bought gallons and gallons of black paint. Stay with me here. His wife was equally unhappy. So together they spent 2 days that week painting the beautiful oak pews in the sanctuary a flat black. Since the church was used only on Sundays, he did it with no interruption and without permission from that church's surroundings committee either. And when Sunday rolled around, his congregants came in, their mouths hanging wide open, and he stood there in his robe and vestments and said, "This is how it feels to be your rector." Well, that was the end of his stay there. And he and his wife moved to the only parish that would take him, a little out-of-the-way parish that at the end of the Llyn Peninsula, if you know Wales, that had no priest for a decade. And there he became involved in the nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s. It was a good move for him, but he didn't need to be so self-destructive about it. but we all operate in our own ways. Sometimes we have psychic agendas that we hide even from ourselves in life. We find out that what we were pursuing was not pursued for itself, but because we wanted to prove something, right? To ourselves, maybe, to our parents, whatever it is. When we sense that we're doing something for the wrong reason, there comes hopefully the opportunity to get out of it, right? This isn't an easy business, but it can be really critical for us. I remember being in Eugene some years ago at an upscale wine and cheese shop downstairs in the 5th Street Market there. Two obviously old acquaintances were in rapt discussion. The man, obviously the owner of the shop, stood there cradling a wheel of some kind of cheese. The conversation was clearly winding up when his friend said to him, "Tell me one more time how good it feels to not be working in mental health any longer." That said it all, right? Here was someone who'd set himself free, now doing something relatively uncomplicated, and she, his friend, was apparently still up to her eyeballs in social services. But I wonder, this is the important part of this, I wonder if he's still selling cheese now or has found a new way to say yes to the part of him that went into the helping professions in the first go-round. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Jesus, the carpenter turned teacher, is telling us that the call comes in the act of doing it. You try something out, and then you see how it unfolds. Many times people experience a voice within that calls them to go deeper into a place where they already are. There they hope to receive what I believe we all long for. That's the call within the call. The thing within the wider context that fits precisely with who we are. The place where we wake up and see why things have worked out as they have to get us to this pregnant present moment with our special expertise and our special confidence to answer the door when opportunity knocks. Bishop Marion Edgar Buddy, I heard it pronounced Buddy. You knew I'd get to this, right? Preached a sermon this last Tuesday at our National Cathedral. Part of it's gone viral. She spoke for many of us here at Southminster when, at the end of her sermon, she spoke directly eye to eye with our new president, very respectfully. But the reaction she got surprised her. Quoting Jesus about giving mercy to the frightened and marginalized, she expected that conservatives who claimed to know their Bibles would nod silently and approve, remembering that Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful," remembering also that Jesus always looked out for those who were in danger. She also said that she was very worried that liberals would give her an earful for being too soft with the man in charge. Well, the exact opposite happened, right? Fox News called her Satan. Satan for quoting Jesus on mercy. A Republican member of Congress called for her to be deported. She's a lifelong citizen of our nation, for God's sake. There were also threats of violence from the right. When her friends reached out to her to ask if she was okay, she answered them this way. She said, "The people who are in danger are the people who fear for their lives and their livelihoods. That's where the focus should be," she said. To those who were shocked by her remarks, Bishop Buddy was incredulous. She said, "This is nothing new." She said, "I've been saying this stuff about justice and mercy for the poor and forgotten for decades." I get that. It's the call within her call that she responded to when she showed the spine that she showed on Tuesday and spoke up for all of us who fear for our LGBTQ friends and family. And when she spoke up for the millions of tax-paying, undocumented, hardworking Americans, the backs of which our economy rides on. And if you noticed, it's the strongest economy in the world. Many people who haven't darkened the door of a church in decades are taking notice. They say they love her courage. Her remarks, they said, are making them thinking about coming back to church. Who knew that church could be so relevant? Well, let me close with this quote from a sermon that Bishop Buddy gave 4 years ago on Zoom during the height of the COVID epidemic. It was delivered at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And these are her words. She said, the title of the sermon is Decisive Moments in Life and Faith. How we learn to be brave. She said, some people, I suppose, are born brave. Most of us must learn to be brave. We all want to be brave when it counts. To be the one who steps up, leans in, does the right thing when it matters most. We want to bring our best when we're called upon to speak with clarity and conviction in a pivotal situation. But how do we become that person so that when the moments come, we are ready? The moments come.